growth. Others are supposed to reduce emissions elsewhere, and technological transformations are way too far in the future. We need a reduction now, and that can only be achieved through a reduction in air traffic.
Mira Kapfinger is co-founder of the Stay Grounded network. She's been fighting the expansion of Vienna's airport for years.
Vienna Airport currently has 2 runways, and it has wanted to expand for a very long time. Expansion plans were announced in 1998, and there has been resistance from the region ever since. And, of course, in recent years, the climate issue has become increasingly serious. We've arrived in the climate crisis, and the airport still wants to take over an additional 660 hectares for this 3rd runway, a climate-damaging monster project. A 3rd runway would effectively generate an additional 3 million tonnes of CO2. It is absolute madness to do that in times of climate crisis. We have saved 660 hectares of Austria's most valuable agricultural land from being used for climate-damaging aerial growth. That is really good. We have reined in the airport's growth mania, but the battle is not won. It cannot be that an international airline ticket is taxed at a lower rate than food. This has to stop.
Transport is a complex issue, one that affects us all. Decades ago, we here in Europe decided to outsource the production of many consumer goods and basic necessities, rather than produce them ourselves. What this meant for transport was clear. We would need more and more of it. Take a high-quality German e-bike, for example. It's made of over 1,000 individual parts that are produced in all different regions of the world. The raw materials for the batteries come from South America or Australia. The batteries are manufactured in China, some of the electronic parts in Germany. The engine is assembled in Hungary and then shipped back to Germany. The German tires are made in Indonesia. The Japanese brake discs are made in Malaysia. The rim tape is made in Vietnam, and the brake components are assembled in Malaysia or China and then installed in Germany. The chain is made in Japan, the fork in Taiwan. The through axle is also produced there, but then assembled into the wheel in Portugal, along with the rims and spokes, before being delivered to Germany. Only if all these parts are delivered on time can the e-bike be completed. Almost all of these goods are shipped from Asia to Europe by ship. First, they pass through the Suez Canal, then they cross the Mediterranean. The destination is usually a northern European port, Rotterdam, Antwerp, or Hamburg, for example. Shipping is responsible for at least 3% of global CO2 emissions and is coming under increasing scrutiny. While the harm it causes the climate is clear, shipping is subject to exceptions. This is true for air transport as well. Neither is covered by either the Paris Climate Agreement or the EU Emissions Trading Scheme. Most goods are delivered according to the just-in-time system. In other words, they are produced only when needed in order to avoid storage time. Only when transport runs absolutely smoothly can the European economy function. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine have shown us how interwoven and fragile these supply and production processes are, and how helpless we are when they're interrupted. Shipping is followed by the next important link in the transportation chain: trucks. Ivan Kolev is a truck driver. He loves his job. His home is in Bulgaria.
It all started with my grandmother, God rest her soul. Her brother, God rest his soul, was also a truck driver 25 or 30 years ago. When he came home, he always brought us children something. We were 2, 4, 6, 8 grandkids. He always had a whole bag of candy for us. One time, he put me in the truck, sat me on his lap, and that was it. From then on, I wanted to be a truck driver too. That was my dream. It's all I know how to do. Driving is all I know.
Some 6.2 million trucks drive Europe's roads, a huge number. And, like Ivan Kolov, most of the drivers come from Eastern Europe.
There are many Eastern European truck drivers in Western Europe. This is mainly for financial reasons. The wages differ enormously. If you earn €1,000 here, you earn €2,000 there. That's already a big difference. It's all due to the money. Where are you going?
Iraq.
Iraq?
Yes.
Great. Is it quiet there?
I don't understand.
Me neither.
Neighbor.
Neighbor?
Romania?
No, Bulgaria.
Sofia?
Plovdiv.
Plovdiv.
Yes.
In France? They stole diesel from me while I was sleeping.
In France?
In France. That's a real problem.
I'm going to Rotterdam.
Holland?
Holland, yes.
This part of the load is going to Marseille, and this part to Ghent, Belgium. Consolidated cargo. Germany, Nuremberg, done. And then back to Iraq. To Suleimania.
Quite a lot.
EU law has strict rules for lorry drivers. They are supposed to return to their home country every 4 weeks, for example. But although the laws are supposed to help drivers work healthier and have more free time, there is resistance. Eastern European drivers fear these rules will restrict their ability to work, rendering them uncompetitive. "75% of freight transport in Europe is handled by trucks. No wonder road transport is so damaging to the climate. In 2019, it accounted for 26% of all CO2 emissions in the EU. While total CO2 emissions have fallen, those generated by road transport have actually risen over the same period. If Europe wants to become climate neutral, vehicles of the future will have to be emission-free. Truck manufacturers are working hard on alternatives to the diesel engine.
One of the major technical challenges for trucks is the question of how we can implement CO2-free transport for freight traffic on the roads. These are powerful vehicles. Their engines have a lot of power, and they need it. They drive many kilometers a year. They need high payloads and a lot of flexibility, and we're sure that these features will remain very important for future vehicles as well. My team and I are interested in developments in the arena of fuels, in particular alternative fuels that could possibly be considered as energy sources for powering trucks. At the moment, we're looking at hydrogen, but there are definitely other candidates that interest us.
There are definitely environmentally friendlier alternatives to the truck. Nevertheless, only one European country has consistently chosen alternatives: Switzerland. In 1994, the Swiss population decided to introduce a higher tax on petrol and to use the revenue to finance rail transport.
Wir hatten schon seit langem eigentlich überlegt, was können wir tun.
We had been thinking for a long time about what we could do about this motorway project coming into Wallis. And then we discovered that other cantons had the same problem. We saw that more and more traffic was coming, that more and more projects were coming, and that this was being felt in everyday life, with these trucks driving through the villages and really making life difficult. And then we said, we can do something about it, together.
Christa Mutter was one of the founders of a popular initiative to protect the Alpine region from too much traffic.
Unsere Initiative sprach ja gegen den Schwerverkehr im Transit.
Our initiative was formed to fight heavy goods traffic in transit. In other words, against the lorries that simply cross Switzerland on their way from Germany to Italy. We understood very quickly that simply launching an initiative against the motorway would not work. You have to convince people to vote for the initiative. And if you say it's against the motorway, that somehow doesn't work. You have to formulate it positively. And that's when we had the idea to offer an alternative. What do we do with the traffic? We shift it to the railways.
Und was ist unser Ziel? Das Ziel ist,
and what is our goal? The goal is no more than 650,000 lorries a year crossing the Alps. And in order to achieve this, one of the things that is being subsidized is the switch to rail traffic. So terminals are being built. Switzerland can and should also participate in terminals in northern Italy and southern Germany.
Noch beteiligen.
It was successful. It was a huge move. Yes, it was a great experience.
Switzerland is the only country in Europe where the train is the most important means of transport for both people and goods. That, in a country whose mountainous terrain doesn't make it an obvious candidate.
Die Bahn ist beliebt geworden. Das Volk hat immer wieder entschieden.
The railway is popular, and the people have repeatedly decided to spend billions on further expansion. And so, rail transport is fully integrated into the economy for both passenger and freight transport.
The large Swiss retail chain Migros is working to reduce its carbon footprint to an absolute minimum. That's why almost all deliveries are made by train.
Migros
is the largest private employer in Switzerland. We employ almost 100,000 people. We belong to the people. Approximately 2 million people in Switzerland are our owners. We are a cooperative. For us, it is important to make logistics efficient and sustainable. That's why we work according to the principle, rail transport before road transport. Air freight transports are absolutely marginal for us. At most, 1% of our goods are flown. If, in exceptional cases, we nevertheless have to fly goods, we charge a fee for these transports. We put this money into a fund, which we then use to promote our own sustainability projects. Switzerland was a pioneer in the development of rail transport, both on the passenger side and on the freight side. In the same vein, we are working on other projects. One is called Cargo Souterrain. This is about building a freight railway under the ground. A second innovative sustainability project is the H2 Mobility project in Switzerland, which allows us to start transporting goods using fuel cell technology.
Migros also has its goods from abroad delivered almost exclusively by train. Transporting goods by rail produces 43 times less CO2 than air transport and 6 times less than transport by truck. The Hupa cargo terminal north of Milan is an indirect consequence of the Swiss referendum.
Guys, can I check off Rotterdam? Okay, Mark. On the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you can't use the saddle.
Okay, got it.
I checked the departing trains. We have various destinations all over Europe, mainly Germany, Switzerland, Northern Europe, Sweden too. At the moment, we have about 25 to 30 pairs of trains here, departures and arrivals per day. We're working at full capacity. Can you by any chance tell me if the HEBU 4628581 is arriving? I don't see it anywhere in the departures.
Yes, it's arriving.
Okay, thanks. All these trains that we bring to Northern Europe travel through Switzerland, through the Gotthard Tunnel. Today, the trains are longer than they used to be. They used to be 550 meters long. Today they are 650 meters long. So you can say there is more work, and that is a good thing.
Nowhere is the railway network as dense as in Europe. Railways have shaped our lives on the continent for the last 2 centuries, connecting cultures and boosting the economy. Today, 226,000 kilometers of track crisscross Europe. If you laid them end to end, you could go around the world 5.5 times. But there's a catch. The EU's rail network is a system of 26 separate rail networks that are not fully compatible with one another. To connect Europe, the EU spent 27 billion euros from 2014 to 2020. 2/3 of that went into expanding the motorways, while only 1/3 was invested in rail networks. Today, we can easily reach major cities by high-speed train, often more quickly than by plane. But there are enormous gaps when it comes to local transportation. In some regions of Europe, the railway network is decaying. The economic boom no longer reaches these areas. Traffic arteries that once brought vibrancy are decaying, cutting off small towns and villages. A tragic example of the decline of the railway is Kočani in northern Macedonia.
The whole platform was full of people. You can't imagine how crowded it was.
Once a day, a freight train with over 100 wagons passed by. This train went through the whole of eastern Macedonia, 100 freight cars, and all of them here at Kočani station. Today, the industry is getting worse and worse, not like before during communist times. Now, no freight train has arrived for over half a year. But it would be possible at any time. The station is open for freight traffic. The passenger train runs in the evening once a day. In the morning it takes people from here to Skopje and back in the evening.
Do you know how important an international train would be for these villages and towns? For Štip, Veleš, Kočani, Vinica, Kamenča, Delčevo, Berovo, Pečevo, the train could reach them all.
Under communism we had laws, work. The European Union is a mafia. Unbelievable. Europe should learn from us, not the other way round.
Without traffic, there is no life, because goods and capital must be constantly on the move. The exchange of goods means life.
The trains have to be used.
Unfortunately, that's no longer the case.
The companies have
disappeared.
If we had express trains, would I stay here and work for 200 euros? No, I would go to Skopje to earn more money there. That's what trains are for.
We have no way to drive anywhere. Those who have a car will go to Skopje. The rest have to stay here in Kočani. It's sad. A catastrophe.
It could be different, but that's the way it is. Let's get to work now. Bye.
It's not only in Europe's south and east that regions are underserved by public transport. The situation is similar here in northern France. Where there are no buses or trains, people move away. The more people turn their backs on their region, the more public services are cut. A vicious circle. The result? Deserted stretches of countryside.
Oh, c'est des grosses côtés ici au cas où ça les donne. Ouais. Restaurant service maïs, bonjour.
In France, something new is being tested. Here, the local government comes to the people.
We help people with their official paperwork. We take care of all kinds of documents. ID, driver's license, vehicle registration, etc. We're here because the next biggest city is quite far away. You have to drive 45 kilometers for every official visit. And there are no buses or trains here. Many people don't have a driver's license at all. We've noticed that there is an urgent need, especially in rural areas like this one in the Aisne department in northern France. It's not easy. We have been active here for 4 years and have received more and more requests.
Bonjour, vous allez bien? Oui, vous? Ça va.
You're here about the pension application?
Exactly. She already filled it out, but they sent back more paperwork.
Well, let's see.
No, you can't exactly say there's a lot going on here. Without a car, it's complicated. There are almost no shops here. If you don't have a car, you have to ask your neighbors for help. Otherwise, it's difficult. I'm glad they're here. They're a great help to us.
Come in, my colleague is waiting for you.
Back there?
Yes. I'm sure our service will continue and will become a model throughout France, maybe even in other countries. At least I hope so. Because there really is a great need. The internet is all well and good, but even if you have a computer, there's no one to help you. We usually process a lot of pension applications. That's the last application people have to fill out in their lives. A lot of them are afraid of doing something wrong in the process, so they need someone to support them. I think the human aspect is the most important thing about our service.
What happens to places that are cut off from the rest of the country? What does it do to the people who live there? Certainly a well-functioning local transport system could change a lot, but in fact, the opposite is the case. In the 1920s, France had a track network of 60,000 kilometers. 1/3 was for rural areas alone. Today, it's down to 18,000 kilometers for the whole of France. One reason for this development? The rise of the automobile. The 1960s and 70s witnessed the birth of individual transport. Having your own car was seen as a sign of prosperity and success. First in Western Europe, then in the East as well. People drove their own cars wherever possible, rather than using public transport. This radically changed our lives and our cities. Car brands today are national emblems. These corporations are part of national identity. They have a great deal of influence. As large employers, they're courted by politicians. Car traffic is responsible for more emissions than trucks and airplanes, accounting for some 62%, and the amount of pollutants is increasing. How can that be? One reason? SUVs. Extremely popular, they burn above average amounts of gasoline. Any success in reducing passenger car emissions has been wiped out with them. But that will soon come to an end. The industry is facing historic upheaval, not least because of rising fuel prices.
Welcome to BMW iDrive. You're about to experience the next generation of BMW iDrive.
For decades, the car industry was protected by the fact that the technology for internal combustion engines was so extremely complicated. It takes 10 years and a lot of money to develop an internal combustion engine. But with the advent of electric cars, this barrier is falling. Now you can offer customers attractive products without having to resort to the internal combustion engine.
Engineer Philippe Shaw is a guru of the European e-car scene. He's developed various electric vehicles over the last 25 years. Now he works for Vercors, a French company that is building a gigafactory for electric car batteries.
Here you can see an interesting comparison between an internal combustion engine, probably from a Renault Megane or Scenic, and the electric motor of the new Megane. At first glance, you can already see that they differ in terms of size, compactness, and materials. On closer inspection, you also notice differences in complexity. The number of hoses, cables, connections, belts. This clearly shows how much more work and resources it takes to produce an internal combustion engine than an electric motor. So jobs will be lost in this part of the manufacturing process, yes. A recent study suggests that of the 6 million or so jobs in the European car industry, about 10% are used to make internal combustion engines. So these jobs will more or less disappear over time. Instead, new jobs will be created to build these electric motors, as well as all the other components of electric cars. According to this study, these jobs should almost balance each other out.
But will there actually be as many jobs in the future? It's a topic of dispute. There's also disagreement about Europe's future as a global car producer. The batteries generate the lion's share of the cost of electric vehicles. They are mostly imported from China or other Asian countries. Europe must be careful not to become even more dependent on third countries. To keep up, the industry has launched a major initiative to produce its own batteries. The European Batteries Alliance. 14 gigafactories for batteries are currently operating in Europe. 7 are European, 4 are Asian, and 3 American. This number is expected to at least triple in the next 10 years, with European projects leading the race. The switch to electric cars could end our dependence on oil. But do electric cars help save the climate and the environment? The production of these vehicles consumes an enormous amount of energy. Rare earths are needed for the batteries. Only after 80,000 kilometers does an electric car have a better climate impact than a car with a combustion engine. Until then, the e-auto has to compensate for the energy-guzzling production. And the cars are only more climate-friendly if they are powered by green electricity. And there's one more problem to tackle: traffic jams.
De inrichting van onze wegen en onze steden is jarenlang gebaseerd.
For years, our cities and streets were car-centric, but that's changing. More and more cities are moving towards considering cars as guests, and bikes as the main mode of transport.
Hilly Talens has worked as a traffic engineer for 35 years. She has helped many Dutch cities become more bike-friendly.
Switching from car to bike is good for your health, good for the environment, good for the climate, and good for you. It makes us more satisfied. The physical activity releases endorphins, and that makes you happy. So cycling is a kind of happiness drug. Bicycles are a good means of transport for distances up to 7 or even 10 kilometers for experienced cyclists. But with e-bikes today, you can travel much further distances, so bikes can compete with cars for medium distances. Here you can see the old world and the new. Back there is the motorway, a main connection between two bigger cities, Arnhem and Nijmegen. It is very busy. At rush hour it gets very crowded and there is congestion. The politicians in this region have decided not to build another motorway, but instead to build a cycling expressway, to get people to switch to cycling. It is 15 kilometers from the center of Nijmegen to the center of Arnhem, but you don't have to cycle the whole distance. It was more about connecting the surrounding villages to the two cities. But with the advent of e-bikes, it has become clear that you can easily cover the whole distance, and you're there in half an hour. When a municipality is willing to change the infrastructure, often something good comes out of it. It attracts more people. People feel more comfortable. The big cities in the Netherlands, especially Utrecht and Amsterdam, are already rethinking and focusing more on cyclists and pedestrians. And I think this will also become more and more common in the rest of the Netherlands and throughout Europe.
Cycle paths are changing the face of cities. In some regions, a lot of money is being spent on this. The pandemic has encouraged a change in thinking. These cycle paths have been added in various European cities over the last 5 years. But to this day, Europe is still a continent of the car. So, how can we get our act together and develop a climate-friendly transport system? It's just possible that electric cars could fundamentally change the way we think about mobility.
So we're on the cusp of the fastest, deepest, most consequential transformation of transport in 100 plus years. I mean, this is every bit as transformative as when the car replaced the horse. It'll transform global geopolitics. It'll impact climate change. I mean, the consequences of this disruption are just profound.
James Arbib is the founder of the independent think tank Rethinks in London. He looks at how new technologies are changing society.
We think by 2030 or so, if that disruption played out, we're going to see self-driving vehicles come to the market. And that changes everything, because self-driving vehicles allow us to unlock the real benefit of electric vehicles, and that's their long lifetime. There are 20 moving parts in an electric vehicle compared to 2,000 in a gasoline vehicle. So it's just less to go wrong. Vastly lower maintenance costs, but more importantly, a much longer vehicle lifetime. So an electric vehicle can last about 1 million miles. But that's irrelevant in the private ownership model we have today, where we all own our own cars because we do 10,000 miles a year. But when you go to a fleet ownership model, where we don't own our vehicles, we just take robo-taxis, each of those cars will do 100,000 plus miles a year. And so you get the benefit of the long vehicle lifetime. And so you can spread the upfront cost of the vehicle over the vehicle lifetime. So each mile you travel costs just 1/1,000,000th of the cost of the vehicle. And that has huge benefits for society as a whole. People are excluded from transportation now who can't afford a car, can't access jobs that are further away, can't partake in the economy. But once we have an autonomous driver, it seems inevitable. Those barriers will fall down and it'll be transformative in all kinds of ways. We're going to see a very, very different world emerge, through the 2030s as we realize the benefits of this new system. It will transform, where we live, where we work, the structure of our cities, and it will open all kinds of new possibilities. Well, on a personal level, I'm most excited about not having to drive again. I think, but that's just because I don't like driving. But I think most excitingly is just the fact that anyone, anywhere will be able to access transport. I think, we believe that in cities we're going to have free transportation. And I think that transforms all kinds of things. It brings everyone who wants to participate in the economy into the economy. No one's excluded from participation because of where they live or lack of transportation or the cost of transport. And I think that's profoundly different to what we see today. And we might even in the future have a right to transportation, as part of a universal basic income or some other form of social contract that we develop.
Driverless taxis are already being tested in several cities in the U.S., but whether and when this technology will become more widespread remains to be seen. It also remains to be seen whether more than just metropolitan areas will benefit from the development. The network of charging stations for e-cars is growing denser. But here, too, there is inequality. So far, many parts of Europe have been left out.
I think we have the potential to solve some of our most complex and pressing problems, from inequality to climate change, enabled by technology across all kinds of sectors. There's no guarantee that we capture all those benefits. My concern is that we fail to capitalize on the opportunities. We take the wrong decisions. We try and prop up and protect uncompetitive, dying industries. It comes down to leadership, ultimately, our ability to take the right decisions to deliver us a much better world, a much more prosperous, much more resilient, a much fairer world.
We have plenty of opportunities to make mobility in Europe more sustainable and fairer, starting now. Many technologies are already available. How consistently we approach the changes depends, above all, on political decisions, along with our willingness to make changes to our habits.
The Conflict Zone with Tim Sebastian.
It's nearly 3 weeks since Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group pointed their tanks towards Moscow. Turns out that 5 days after the episode, Wagner's boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was having talks with Putin in the Kremlin. What does it all mean? My guest is Russian political scientist Ekaterina Schulman, now based in Berlin.
Conflict Zone. In 30 minutes on DW. DW's talk show. Strong opinions, clear positions, international perspectives. Every week, we get to the point on a current topic.
But we are currently
actually well schools in India. One thing with climate change.
Open, controversial, committed. To the point. On DW.
I love Nasreen. I've loved her since the beginning, because of her character, because of her courage, and how she thinks.
Nasreen Sotoudeh. For nearly 4 decades, she's fought peacefully for greater freedoms in her homeland Iran, in spite of barbaric government reprisals. An intimate look into her life. Nasreen starts July 29th on DW.
This is DW News, live from Berlin. The United Nations says a mass grave has been found in Sudan.
Local people were forced to dispose of the bodies in a mass grave, denying those killed a decent burial.
The UN says at least 87 victims were killed in a massacre in West Darfur and blames a paramilitary group. Also coming up, Thailand fails to elect a new prime minister. Despite winning recent elections, Peter Limnach-Hohenrath couldn't win support in the parliament, with pledges to reform strict pro-monarchy laws and reduce the military's influence. And Germany's foreign minister unveils a new strategy for dealing with China. Amid rising political tensions, Annalena Baerbock says Germany wants to reduce its dependence on its biggest trading partner, but not at all costs. I'm Ben Fazul, welcome. The United Nations Human Rights Office says it's found evidence of a mass grave in Sudan's West Darfur region, where at least 87 people were buried last month. The UN office says it has credible information that the breakaway Rapid Support Forces paramilitary and their allies carried out the massacre. It says many of the buried people belonged to a non-Arab ethnic Masalit group. Their bodies were dumped in 2 shallow graves near the city of El Janaina. Ethnic violence has escalated in recent weeks, with rival military factions at war for months now. Ravina Ramdazi is a spokesperson for the United Nations Human Rights Office and gave more details.
Local people were forced to dispose of the bodies in a mass grave, denying those killed a decent burial in one of the city's cemeteries. At least 37 bodies were buried on the 20th of June in a 1-meter deep mass grave. Another 50 bodies were buried on the same site the next day, including bodies of 7 women and 7 children.
Carl Skembri is in charge of Sudan operations for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Here's what he had to say about the latest developments.
Well, there is very little yet that we know beyond what has been announced today by the United Nations. What we do know is that Darfur is the seat, is the theater of widespread atrocities. We see that through our own staff, many of whom had to flee. Many fled to South Sudan or other areas in the country itself, but they've fled from massacres, from all sorts of attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. All our offices and warehouses have been looted. So it's total mayhem. It's catastrophic for the civilians there. And today is the ultimate proof, if you like, that these atrocities are really being committed, and we need to get to the bottom of who did this, and these people need to be held accountable.
Over the past days, we've also been reporting, of course, on the fighting in and around the capital, Khartoum. How is Darfur linked to the ongoing fighting?
Well, Darfur, the dynamics there are slightly different in that there is a huge ethnic component to the fighting that we're seeing around Darfur, which is historical, and it's what led to previous ethnic cleansing and genocides, and God forbid that's probably what's happening right in front of our eyes. The fighting in Darfur took a bit longer to start, but once the Khartoum was in total chaos, there has been this opportunistic rise in violence over there, obviously linked to the rest of the country, but also with its own dynamics, making it an extremely difficult scenario. It's completely out of bounds for us as a humanitarian organization right now. We cannot operate safely. A lot of our staff are fleeing for their lives. A lot of the people fleeing from Darfur are actually injured. They're in very bad conditions. Many of them are not even managing to make it out alive.
Carlos Cambry, thank you very much for joining us there from the Norwegian Refugee Council. He's in charge of Sudan operations and was joining me there from Nairobi. And now to Thailand, where the country's front-runner to become Prime Minister has failed to secure parliamentary support. Peter Limjaroenrat was the only candidate, but could not gain enough votes from lawmakers to win. Although his reformist coalition won May's general election, was not able to secure the support of the military-backed members of the Senate, which he needed to become Prime Minister. A second vote for the top job is expected next week. Peter had pledged to reform strict laws protecting the monarchy and reduce the military's influence. So what does this vote mean for Thailand and what happens next? Questions I put to Philip Sherwell, Asia correspondent for the Sunday Times in Bangkok.
Well, it means that Thailand continues to have just a caretaker prime minister. He's the former coup leader who has been in power for 9 years. There were elections in May. As you've mentioned, the reformist coalition led by Move Forward Party, a progressive new force in Thai politics, was the surprise and comfortable winner in those elections. But to become prime minister, it's not just enough to have the majority support of MPs in the lower house, which Peter Limjaroenrat does have, but he also has to secure support from unelected senators who are appointed by the former junta. And today's debate of the joint chamber really focused very strongly on Move Forward's desire and push to reform these strict royal defamation laws. And the conservative forces in there, be it sort of military party MPs, pro-military MPs or senators, just have repeatedly attacked these plans for reforms, comparing them to attempts to subvert the monarchy, which is an extremely powerful and strong institution in Thailand. And ultimately, when the votes came in, although he had a comfortable lead amongst MPs, he fell short of enough votes amongst the two chambers.
So what's next for Thailand?
Yeah, well, we face a period perhaps of paralysis here. The Parliament will reconvene next week, and the ruling coalition has vowed that they will resubmit Peter's name. But unless the Move Forward backs down on royal reforms, it seems very unlikely he'll be able to win round enough senators to get through. And then we're into positions where, lots of backroom negotiations, coalition deals. There's talk of whether representatives of one of the pro-military parties could stitch together enough numbers with the senators. It's a very uncertain time. What is very likely is we'll see a return to street protests, which have characterized Thailand for the last couple of decades. The supporters of Move Forward are very angry. They note that their party won this election fair and square, or emerged as the largest party, and they feel that the senators are thwarting the democratic will. So we had protesters on the streets yesterday, and they'll be returning again in coming days, they say, particularly if next week, as seems very likely, Peter does not manage to emerge as Prime Minister.
The analysis and latest there from Philip Sherwell, the Sunday Times in Bangkok. Thank you very much for joining us here on DW.
Thank you.
Germany's cabinet has approved its first ever strategy for dealing with China, its biggest trading partner, but also a potential geopolitical rival. The new policy says German companies must de-risk or reduce their dependence on Beijing without cutting off cooperation. Recent supply chain problems and human rights issues have caused concern in Berlin. Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock introduced the strategy earlier today.
We need to focus on our economic security more. So that means that cluster risks that don't just impact the individuals, but rather impact the entire national economy must be minimized. Thus, companies that make themselves particularly dependent on the Chinese market will increasingly have to bear the financial burden of this risk. And part of the economic security is that companies need to ensure that in their supply chains they are aware of the human rights and ensure that they are not violated. Naturally, we have a responsibility to human rights, but we also have to reduce the risk for Germany as a business location and also Europe, because if we accept the violations of human rights, this will also have impact on European countries.
Let's talk about the complexities of that very complex issue with our China analyst Clifford Coonan. We're talking about German companies who are supposed to bear the costs if they're overly dependent on China in the future. I mean, there are some German companies that make a huge chunk of their profits from China. Is that suddenly going to change?
I don't think it's going to change, but I don't think it's going to be as straightforward as it has been up till now. I think basically since the Ukraine war and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which saw German companies left exposed who were in Russia, I think the situation has changed in terms of how the German federal government views the activities of its major industries. We've also seen various strains and stresses in the relationship with China and how issues like human rights have kind of come to the fore. So I think what they're saying is now that, yes, we want to de-risk the relationship, keep doing business, but not as it was before, but by reducing possible risks and exposures to what could go wrong in China.
Well, there had already been a consumer backlash against some companies involved in with supply chains involving slave labor in Xinjiang, for example, in China. Now we're seeing a backlash from the government, are we? I mean, how are companies going to pay attention to something like human rights violations? It's a highly political, not business topic usually.
Yeah. I think what we saw, if you take the example of Volkswagen, which at its shareholders meeting in May, you had shareholders throwing cake at the board to make their point. Shareholders meetings are a classic place where the public can make their feelings known about how businesses are behaving. That kind of thing is very bad publicity. More than just being very bad publicity, though, it's also bad for the bottom line because ethical investment funds, for example, won't want to get involved in companies that they feel are involved in bad practice in places such as Xinjiang. So what you're seeing is this is kind of giving a political framework to that, that these actions, that companies are expected to behave in a certain way. And I think since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, again, I think it's also made that there is a growing awareness that you cannot no longer separate these things as easily as before.
But if a company gets itself into trouble financially because it's too dependent on China, and that was obvious or has been pointed out by the government, what happens at the end of the day? Is this company left flailing? Will the German government not step in and bail out, say, a company that's flailing?
I think ultimately they will. I mean, if you look at, say, this German state of Lower Saxony has got an 11% stake in Volkswagen, for example, and it's not going to leave its own company in which it's got a shareholding. It's not going to leave it flailing, as you say.
And a huge amount of German employees.
Exactly, right. This is a very political, very important political situation, position. But I think that I think you will see. They will still probably intervene, but it's not going to be as easy as before. They're talking about things like stress tests. They're going to make companies show their level of exposure. I think a lot of this is actually driven by economics as well. We saw during the pandemic that supply chains were heavily affected, and people were suddenly realized that too much exposure to a place like China is risky anyway. So it's not just a political decision. I think that companies also are self-regulating to that extent, that I think they will be looking at ways of diversifying, say, their supply chains. But this is a very important political message to back up that activity.
And what about the response then from China? There's, it takes two to tango, and this is a toxic relationship we're talking about. We're talking about a competitor, partner and systemic rival, as Germany's national strategic and national security strategy points out.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, this is not a great basis for a relationship to have a competitor and strategic rival as well as your partner. But I think there is a realization that that something is going to change in China. They don't like the word de-risking. They don't like the word decoupling. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of bad economic data coming out of China. We've seen pressure on the Chinese economy. They need Europe now. They need the West. In a way that they didn't as much in the boom years of double-digit percentage growth every year. So
long term, will they need them long term?
I think so. I mean, there's still the big issue of technology. A lot of the key technologies are coming from the West. This is obviously a big issue for the Americans, which is why they've introduced export controls on things like microchips. So longer term, they realize that they're going to focus on Europe and also try and keep Europe and the US apart. So there's even more complex political issues at play as well.
Complex issue just gets more complex. Thank you for pointing that out. Clifford Cooner now, China analyst. You're watching DW News. Coming up next in DW News Asia, what were leaders of Indo-Pacific countries doing at a NATO summit in Lithuania? Biresh Banerjee will have that story and more after a short break. I'm Ben Fazulin in Berlin. Thanks for watching.
Every journey is full of surprises. We've gone all out to give you some tips.
One day in Vienna, following the footsteps of the great Beethoven.
I'm in Europe's northernmost town, the place of extremes. Great times, long past, but still very much alive.
DW Travel, your guide to the special hotspots in Germany, Europe, and the world.
Do you recognize where exactly I am?
It was fun, and I have learned a lot. Arts, culture, history, all there.
DW Travel.
Extremely worth a visit.
This is DW News Asia. Coming up today, NATO turns towards Asia. The alliance has been meeting leaders of Indo-Pacific countries as it makes a push to deepen engagement with the region. But what's driving this push, and what form could it take? And an 81-year-old fights for justice for the forgotten victims of the Vietnam War, the nearly 5 million Vietnamese suffering the after effects of being poisoned by the herbicide Agent Orange. I'm Biresh Banerjee. Welcome to DW News Asia. Glad you could join us. The question of Ukraine's NATO membership may have been the main focus of the summit in Vilnius, but on the sidelines, there was a fair bit of engagement between NATO and Indo-Pacific nations. Australia, Japan, New Zealand and South Korea were meeting an organization that has historically always been transatlantic. Only now it appears to want to be Indo-Pacific as well. The four nations mentioned aren't NATO members, but partner countries. And it's a partnership that's being redefined in a time of war.
In the current severe international security environment, the security of Europe and the Indo-Pacific are inseparable. Japan and NATO share the understanding that unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force will not be tolerated, regardless of where in the world, and share the understanding of the importance of maintaining and strengthening a free and open international order based on the rule of law. It follows that Japan and NATO, which share fundamental values and strategic interests, are further deepening our ties.
And joining me now for more is Garima Mohan. She's a senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific program at the GMF think tank and an expert in Europe's ties with the Indo-Pacific. Garima, what is driving NATO interest in the Indo-Pacific?
Great to be back on your show, Biresh. I think it's important to note that NATO's interest in the Indo-Pacific is not new. We already started looking at mentions of Indo-Pacific a few years ago in NATO documents, much before Ukraine. And the key reason for this interest was, of course, China. China's increasing influence in Europe, and NATO, as well as other organizations, started looking at the implications of that. Incidents of political influence, economic intimidation, the direct and indirect security threats which come from China's investment in critical infrastructure in Europe. All of these things started driving NATO to look at the Indo-Pacific and talk to countries in the region who might be facing similar threats vis-a-vis China. I would like to note that NATO has had global partners for a long time, including Japan, South Korea, Australia. These countries were also crucial in providing support for Ukraine. And increasingly, NATO has also been interested in engaging India. Secretary General Stoltenberg spoke at the Raisina Dialogue in India. NATO officials have started meeting with Indian officials, both to understand the big security threat from China on the Indian border, but also to understand India's relationship with Russia. So all around, quite a few factors driving NATO's interest in this key region.
So this engagement, what is the kind of engagement we are talking about? Are we talking about security cooperation, NATO troops in the Indo-Pacific? What form of engagement will this eventually turn out to be?
That is the million-dollar question. For now, NATO's engagement in the region is pretty much coordination, trying to understand the experiences of these countries in the Indo-Pacific, trying to understand how security challenges in the Indo-Pacific can have an impact on Europe. The two theaters are connected, European and Indo-Pacific regions are connected. And the most important example of that is Russia-China coordination and alignment that we have seen emerge in even before Ukraine, but really became a crucial security concern for NATO and other members after Ukraine. So I think that is an important connection that NATO is making by engaging with the Indo-Pacific. What form this engagement will take going forward? Will that stay at the coordination level, or does it mean NATO presence in the region? That is still an open question. There was talks of creating a NATO office in Japan, which were vetoed by Paris. I think it's important to look at what countries in the region want, what do Asian countries want, and there you would have varied responses. Some would say, why not? More NATO means more hands on deck when it comes to dealing with, for example, Taiwan contingency, China's aggressive behavior in the region, why not? But a number of other countries would have questions as to why should NATO engage in a far-off region, and would it not be more important if it was focused on guaranteeing European security first?
China had also something to say about the recent summit, the NATO summit in Vilnius. It said, and I quote, "It resolutely opposes NATO's eastward movement into the Asia-Pacific region." Is there a danger here, Garima, that NATO engagement in the region further destabilizes it?
I think that would be an exaggeration. I think Chinese reactions to any sort of statements are like that these days. We see a lot of grandstanding from China. I think if an actor is destabilizing the Indo-Pacific right now, it is China and not NATO. NATO's engagement has been very surface level, and I think the coordination between European countries and Indo-Pacific countries when dealing with similar challenges from Russia and China is just inevitable. So I don't think any one country can have a veto on how other actors engage with its region. And I don't think in the future there's any real possibility of, a massive NATO engagement, troops on the ground in the Indo-Pacific. So we have to be a little balanced in how we look at this.
Just on the subject of coordination within Europe and within NATO, just to go back to the point you raised earlier about France opposing the opening of a NATO liaison office in Japan, why is France against this?
I think the broader point of NATO engagement, I think we have to look at how there's a crucial lesson being learned in Europe that the experiences of dealing with an authoritarian Russia will be similar to those of China, and Europe shouldn't make the same mistake of being over-dependent on China in critical sectors as it was on Russia. So I think on that argument, European countries are on the same level. But when it comes to their China policies, they're still being defined. As we saw when President Macron went to Beijing, he took a very different tone from what Ms. von der Leyen has said about the China challenge. And therefore, I think European countries are still trying to figure out what exactly is their relationship with China. How much do they want to push? And therefore, some are more cautious than others. I mean, today we are expecting to see the China strategy in Germany. That would also, lead to some clarifications. But I think it remains to be seen where the chips will fall on European China policies and China approaches. Until that time, we would see these different reactions. Countries like France sometimes being a bit more cautious. At other times, they're not. For example, when sending French frigates through the Indo-Pacific, they're quite forward-leaning.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thanks so much for joining us again. Garima Mohan from the GMF.
Thank you for having me.
Now, an 81-year-old is making a fresh attempt at suing major chemical firms for their role in damaging the health of millions during the Vietnam War. Tran Ton Na is suing 14 firms for producing the herbicide known as Agent Orange that the United States sprayed over the jungles of Vietnam to fight the enemy. But it also had an impact on nearly 5 million people, including her, who were exposed to it. She, however, is the first and only civilian to take this to court.
Tran Ton Na is in a long fight. She has been trying to win compensation for Vietnamese victims exposed to Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, during which she worked as a war correspondent. The toxic herbicide was sprayed over Vietnam's forests by the United States, a strategy by the US to deter their enemy, North Vietnam. What it left behind was a public health disaster. Our objective is not money. We want the world to know the crime of war, chemical war. The US dropped 68 million liters of Agent Orange over Vietnam between the 1960s and 70s. It has since been linked to several health issues in people exposed to the white powder. Na herself remembers being doused in it once. A year on, her daughter was born with a congenital heart defect and died soon after. I had always blamed myself for being a bad mother. Then I discovered I was a victim of Agent Orange. I knew then that it was Agent Orange dioxin that killed my child, not me. That loss will never be healed. There are multiple accounts of Vietnamese children being born with deformities of the limb, spine, and more. Estimates show that 4.8 million people were directly exposed to Agent Orange, and more than 3 million have developed health problems. In Hanoi, a state-sponsored facility has been giving vocational training to Agent Orange victims. They learn to stitch, create art, as well as read and write, in the hope that these skills will help them earn a livelihood instead of falling by the wayside of Vietnamese society. In 2014, Na filed a lawsuit in France against 14 companies such as Dow Chemical and Monsanto that produced Agent Orange. The companies argued that they were not responsible for how the US military decided to use their product. In the end, the French court threw out her case. When I received the message that was sent to me, it's true that I had a shock in my heart because I wasn't expecting it. I had already prepared myself for the worst, but such a decision, it stunned me. A surprising decision, considering that US war veterans have received compensation for their exposure to Agent Orange and continue to receive tax-free monthly payments. Na, however, is a fighter. She is crowdsourcing money to file an appeal in 2024. She has no intention of giving up. I promise that I will continue till my last breath.
That does it for today. There's more news and updates from the region on our website, dw.com/Asia. We're back again at the same time tomorrow. We'll see you then. Goodbye.
The conflict zone with Tim Sebastian.
It's nearly 3 weeks since Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group pointed their tanks towards Moscow. Turns out that 5 days after the episode, Wagner's boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was having talks with Putin in the Kremlin. What does it all mean? My guest is Russian political scientist Ekaterina Shulman, now based in Berlin.
Conflict Zone. Next on DW. What are sports all about? Winning? Fighting? Scoring? We say they're about never giving up. Sports Life, every weekend on DW.
It's nearly 3 weeks since Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group pointed their tanks towards Moscow and were branded traitors and mutineers by the government. But now there's a new twist. Turns out that 5 days after the episode, in which more than a dozen Russians were killed, Wagner's boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was having talks with Putin in the Kremlin. What does it all mean? My guest is Russian political scientist Ekaterina Shulman, now based in Berlin.
The president is still in his place. The system has survived. So far, no personal changes has occurred at all.
So how many more surprises can we expect from this so-called rebellion? How damaged are the power structures inside the Kremlin? Is Putin really in charge or being dragged along by events that he no longer controls? This drama appears far from over. Ekaterina Shulman, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you.
So now we learn that 5 days after he led a supposed rebellion, set off in a convoy for Moscow and got branded a traitor, Yevgeny Prigozhin was sitting chatting with the president in the Kremlin. Another day, another version, full of holes, question marks, contradictions. What do you make of all this?
Well, it's not a happy topic to comment upon for me as either a Russian citizen or a former Russian civil servant, which I was for quite some years, because it does seem rather an extraordinary meeting in all senses of the word. It's extraordinary in its essence. It's also extraordinary in the informational wrapping. The Kremlin was denying the fact that it knew about Prigozhin's whereabouts about the same days, it appears, when he was actually in the Kremlin. And the very fact of the president meeting with a leader of armed rebels, and not just himself alone, like, Napoleon going to visit Georges Cadoudal in his cell, but equipped with, as Kremlin says, 35 of his followers, that does not look very much like the leader of the nation receiving the penitent ex-mutineer, but rather like the heads of two gangs coming together to discuss their mutual interests, their businesses, the division of assets, and such like matters. I was always saying that every chair of Russian studies or every Russia-oriented think tank should have a criminologist on its staff. It will help to clarify matters.
But what do you draw from all this, at least the chaotic messaging, that the system is in free fall, overcome by panic or inertia, that it's been seriously weakened, that the wheels are coming off? What should we be thinking?
Well, that may be rather too strong language just at present, although in a couple of months' time it may be much closer to the truth. The system, as I see it, is certainly not going to get any stronger. The messaging, for that matter, is not getting more coherent at all. It is strange that days after, or actually almost immediately after this meeting in the Kremlin, the smear campaign started on federal state TV against Prigozhin, and a very interestingly oriented campaign at that. There was not much talk about the treason or about stabbing the army at the back or about his being connected with the West, which is usually the favorite topic of Russian propaganda, or even of his being the Ukrainian spy, but it was all about the money. He was portrayed as a person who made enormous profits from the Russian state and then literally beat the hand that fed him, which is very much at cross purposes with the whole patriotic war messaging, unification of the nation messaging, the idea that Russia is at some sort of existential struggle with the West for its very existence based on its values. So now we have, and again, not just we perceive it with the analysts, with the Russia watchers, but the TV watcher is supposed to see a commercial conflict, in fact. Another oligarch who has made himself rich on the state budget and then got ambitions for something political. In fact, something like another Khodorkovsky or Berezovsky, with due respect to the military atmosphere. So it's like Khodorkovsky with tanks.
Except that this oligarch has forces that are probably better trained than any other in Russia at the moment and would be seen by Putin as vital to the war effort in Ukraine. That's his strong point, isn't it? That's Prigozhin's strong point.
Yes, I'm not capable of judging of his military capability. That's not the kind of thing I understand very much about, but he certainly has an army of his own which is loyal to him and not to anyone else, and for very valid reasons, because their very existence is illegal in the eyes of the Russian law. There is no law about private military companies, but there are a couple of criminal code articles exactly describing what they're doing, and these involve quite heavy punishments from 10 to 15 years of penal service. So again, for the Russian law, for the Russian state machine, these people are criminals. Even if the president receives them in the Kremlin, they still have no legal footing. So their loyalty can be only to the chief that pays them and protects them from the law. And this chief is strong enough to manage to get a meeting with the president in order to, bargain, evidently, with him, also about the fate of his followers.
Are you not surprised that Prigozhin is still alive?
I'm surprised at the whole thing. But once you start doing crazy stuff, like beginning a war with your neighbor, all sorts of crazy consequences emerge. So we started being surprised on the 24th of February and haven't finished yet.
Tatiana Stanova from the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center says Russian elites are in a state of silent shock. They're asking themselves, how was it possible to get out of such a mutiny unpunished? Do you have an answer to that?
Well, I don't do psychological analysis at long distance, but again, being something of a bureaucrat myself at heart, I can relate to this state of things. We do not know really much about Russian elites. It's a closed community. They do not readily communicate. But certainly the things which are happening are rather out of the ordinary. But again, we are dealing with so many myths and so many propaganda concepts, handmade illusions, that I'm wondering whether the illusion of this idea of the strong and vindictive president who does never forgive treason, who is ever ready to avenge humiliation, whether it was kind of true during peaceful times when oil prices were high and relations with the outside world were good, whether it still holds true during this time when it seems that his only goal is political survival. If we think that this is the goal, then everything else becomes rational and explainable.
Are you talking about a new Putin whose political opponents don't, for some reason, jump out of their upstairs windows with quite the frequency with which they have in recent years?
We'll have to wait and see. But so far, well, yes, some people have jumped out of windows. Other people have emigrated and lived rather peacefully abroad. Other people have been killed or otherwise molested abroad. So I do not exactly see any coherent policy here either. But of course, a very open-faced threat like an armed mutiny is something different from even attempting to buy your own parliamentary fraction, which is what Khodorkovsky was actually accused of in political terms. This is something new. All other threats or perceived threats from the military side were indeed punishable by death. We could remember the cases of General Lebed, who could have been perceived as something of a rival. There was a less-known case of General Rokhlin, who was found dead in his bed, and his wife accused of murder. So military was always perceived by actually Soviet political leadership as potentially dangerous and not to be trusted. This is a tradition stemming from the end of the Second World War, when Stalin was afraid of the popularity of Marshal Zhukov and of actual political importance of the army that just won the historic victory. Since then, it has been a tradition that secret services are political actors, but the army and the navy are not. Even in the war, even during the war, we have not yet seen any change in this direction. Prigozhin and his boys do not represent the military exactly, but they certainly represent the military force. And you see that while peaceful political opposition is being systematically crushed, if you have a tank and a couple of guns, then you can get yourself invited to the Kremlin and you get talked with in quite respectful manner. I'm not sure that
that's a risky precedent to set, isn't it? That's a very risky precedent.
That's exactly the point, yes. But once you find yourself as a state, as a leader in the troubled waters of the war that you can neither win nor put an end to, you get all sorts of queer guests in your cabinet.
When all the spin and exaggeration are stripped away, what do you think was really behind Prigozhin's so-called march for justice? Was it opportunistic? Do you believe that despite his assurances, he had an intention of actually ousting Putin?
If we strip all the paraphernalia away from this, we see a very typical event that happens in Africa about every 6 months.
In Africa, but not in Russia.
Why should we think ourselves so different? Because the territory is bigger? Because the climate is different? Well, because we have more cities and universities, but sadly, this seems to be no obstacle to, well, political degradation, to put it in simple terms. So these things happened in the countries that cannot hold their legal violence together. So there emerges other alternative forces which then demand something from the government. Usually, the beginning of such a revolt, which can or cannot terminate in a change of power, is dissatisfaction with payment, with leadership, with working conditions, something or other. So it's a kind of labor conflict, again, only with tanks. So you start frightening your government with yourself and your supporters in the hope of getting better working and living conditions, or just getting more money, or to have your grievances listened to. So political science tells us that despite the very armed and violent appearance of such marches, the leaders are actually anxious to avoid bloodshed whenever possible, because their goal is bargaining, not actual regime change. Although if regime is weak enough at that point and people who organize the mutiny cannot directly access or understand how weak it really is, regime change may occur.
Yekaterina Shulman, one of the most extraordinary aspects of this saga is that Prigozhin was able to trash Putin's entire justification for invading Ukraine, calling it a lie. How damaging were those comments? He hasn't withdrawn them.
No, he has not. And in his recent, the most recent of his public appearances, so those voicemails he's been sending to the nation through Telegram that happened before the mutiny, he went from attacking the Ministry of Defense leadership to actually attacking, well, not the president by name, but him as the head of the system. the justification for the march was seeking for justice, protesting against corruption, and the need to change this whole system, which is not effective. The system is the president, or the president exemplifies and symbolizes the system. So you cannot say that it was just an appeal for the president's arbitrage in his quarrel with the Minister of Defense and the head of General Headquarters. He went higher than that. And yes, it was extraordinary to hear him saying that NATO was not actually planning to attack Russia, that Ukraine was not planning to attack Russia, that it was all a tale spinned by the army leadership for the president in order to get more medals and more budget money. This message has been heard by those that get the information from Telegram. And this is a big and growing chunk of Russian population. It has not been heard at all, but by those whose main source of information is TV.
We talked a little bit about how the effects of all this on the system. Can you, to any extent, quantify the damage that the system has sustained with this episode? And what early signs would you be looking for if the system were to unravel further? How might that manifest itself?
First things first, the president is still in his place. The system has survived. So far, no personal changes has occurred at all, either in the Kremlin, broadly understood, or in the Ministry of Defense, or for the matter of that, in Wagner. So it looks like for the moment we have this uneasy equilibrium where everyone got their own. Prigozhin seems to be losing his media empire, or at least putting it on hold because the information is really very muddled. We cannot be sure.
But if it goes wrong from here, what would we be seeing?
We have the uneasy status quo just for the moment. What will be the signs that unraveling goes further? Well, I would expect in this case, the bad example of Prigozhin to be followed by somebody else. It may start low-key with, for example, videotaped addresses of some military personnel to the president and or to the Minister of Defense. Again, listing some grievances and asking to be listened to. Or we may witness elite defections on a higher level than previously. For example, somebody from the government or formerly from the government may disappear and then appear on the other side of the border, ready maybe to talk about something, to make some public declarations, or to make non-public communications with the authorities of, say, European Union or United States. Or we may see some leaks on the level of this leaked phone conversation between Mr. X and Mr. Z, saying something. By the way, speaking about leaks, which are a sign of the system not being able to do what it most prides itself on doing, preserve the secrecy. The information about the meeting of the president with the Wagner people was published by the French newspaper Libération. And after that, Kremlin had to, again, it's not clear for me why they could have kept denying it. It's no problem for them to deny anything, but they, for some reason, thought themselves obliged to actually confirm that the meeting took place. It means that somebody over there in a very close circle in the Kremlin is talking to, well, somebody who is then talking to the mainstream European press. This is a sign.
You characterized the Russian state recently as a system mostly based on imitation, make-believe, hypocrisy and lip service. Isn't that pretty much the way it was in Soviet times? So could this system collapse the way the Soviet Union did?
The Soviet Union had a couple of other things, like coherent ideology, absolutely closed borders, and centralized economy. This made it at once durable and brittle. It happens with such unnatural systems. Our current system enjoys a more or less market economy, a more or less functional system of civic bureaucracy, which actually holds the country together, and the advantage of open borders, which allows to get rid of dissent without direct and widespread violence. So it is not a Soviet system, but it has quite a lot of similarities with the late version of Soviet regime, when it was almost all pretense. No believer in ideology any longer, not much violence exercised by the state, and absolutely no enthusiasm on the part of the people about anything. And last but not least, dissatisfaction of the elites with the way they live and the spreading idea that change may be to their advantage.
Dissatisfaction of the elites. According to some reports, a number of security personnel called in sick on the 24th of June, not wanting to show which side they were on in case things got out of control. Another report said these were Moscow police officers hedging their bets just as they had in 1991 during the attempted coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. Was there a lot of that happening on June the 24th? And is this a police state that can't rely on its police any longer?
Well, again, to an extent it can. As you see, there were no open defections. No one united himself or no armed body united itself with the mutineers.
But they stayed home. But they stayed home instead.
Yes, they stayed at home. That's the very, very Russian thing to do. And as a political scientist, I'm kind of glad that we have this good example to demonstrate what is authoritarian popularity. You remember all this talk about the support for the president? How the country is united behind him? So even compared to other autocrats like Erdogan, the Russian president cannot rely on, well, anyone except perhaps the FSO people, the Federal Guardsmen Service. They are or seem to be still around him.
Who can Putin rely on? Who can Putin rely on after these missteps, visible missteps?
The bodyguard service, the FSO. Evidently, he thinks he can rely on Rosgvardia and Zolotov because he's arming them. They are to receive, and there's a public promise on it, they are to receive heavy armament, which means that this armament will be taken from the front line or will not go to the front line because there's suddenly the realization that we actually need forces in Moscow, not somewhere out there in Ukraine, because we need to defend ourselves rather than think about getting our neighbors' land.
How far might this rebellion, if that's what it was, impact Russia's approach to the war in Ukraine?
That's a good question. If the idea that I have just tried to describe will take root in the minds of decision makers, it may lead to their, let's put it carefully, to their greater readiness to at least try to freeze the conflict or even to concede something for the sake of being able to stop those hostilities which are putting the very system at risk. The Russian expression for this is «Не до жиру быть бы живо». We should not think about gain, we have trouble enough keeping ourselves alive. That's a very good frame of mind for the beginning of any sort of peace talks.
How far do you think Putin has scaled back his objectives in Ukraine, or is he still dreaming of taking Kiev?
It's not about taking Kiev per se. It's about installing a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. That's why there was so much talk about it's not being an occupational campaign. If there's a pro-Russian government in Kiev, there is absolutely no need for Russia to take any bit of Ukrainian territory, because all Ukrainian territory will be pro-Russian. That's their idea. I cannot say whether it is still alive in the heads of anyone or not. But the very fact of annexating territory was due to the realization of the fact that no pro-Russian government in Kiev is forthcoming anytime soon.
And you don't see anybody still in the Kremlin dreaming of that? I mean, they haven't been characterized by their detailed knowledge or accurate knowledge of the situation in Ukraine, have they? And judging by events, it's not been very good.
We do not know. We do not know. And of course, we do not know whether anyone is dreaming about anything. I have the sense that the most optimistic scenario, which is now in the heads of Russian decision makers, is this. We wait out till Ukrainian counteroffensive peters out without tangible results. Then we wait out till presidential elections in the states. because we have all the time in the world, but the democracies are always chained to the electoral cycle. And then Donald the Savior will probably step forward and save Mother Russia. That's the idea, again, to the best of my estimation. I will not be defending it as a very realistic scenario, but I do suspect it's their favorite one.
That's really what some of them are counting on, a Trump victory in the US next year in the presidential elections?
Once you start dreaming, dream big.
Will Moscow have been heartened that Ukraine wasn't offered a timetable for joining NATO at the Vilnius summit?
Cannot really estimate that. These are military matters outside of the field of my expertise.
All right.
But what I know is that they're watching this very closely, and I know it not from some sort of insider sources, but from their open declarations. They're talking very much about it. So we can safely say that the eyes of Moscow are now all in Vilnius. By the way, good time to do something in Russia, maybe, when the eye of Sauron is turned elsewhere.
How long has Putin got to put things right? To reestablish to reestablish control?
Let's try to imagine this best case scenario. Suppose it all comes true. Counteroffensive achieves nothing. Vilnius summit ends with some sort of empty declaration. Donald Trump wins the presidential elections in 2024, and President Putin wins presidential elections in Russia in 2024, and no protests occur after the elections, because the danger of authoritarian elections is not losing them, but encountering public dissatisfaction after the results are being published, like in Belarus in 2020. Suppose all this happens, the conflict is frozen on the Korean model, which is now such a favorite with Russian public speakers, and then the regime has the time to readjust its logistical chains to further revamp its relations with both China and India, to isolate itself informationally from the global internet, and then, well, yes, it can survive for such time as the president has physically as a person, and then to try to rearrange matters once he is no longer among the group of elites, more or less the same people who are now the holders of the Russian Federation, the shareholders of this great and partially successful commercial enterprise. So this is the best case scenario. It is not an impossible one.
Ekaterina Schulman, very good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Interest, the global economy. Our portfolio, DW Business Beyond.
Here's a closer look at the project.
Our mission, to analyze the fight for market dominance.
East versus West.
Get a step ahead with DW Business Beyond. DW's crime fighters are back. Africa's most successful radio drama series continues. This season, the stories focus on hate speech, cholera prevention, and sustainable charcoal production. All episodes are available online. And of course, you can share and discuss on DW Africa's Facebook page and other social media platforms. Crime Fighters, tune in now.
DW Stories. On TikTok, we unpack.
Every day the world crashes into us.
Higher taxes for the rich.
Women worldwide work for free.
Why does Pakistan have so many fake doctors? And our timeline becomes overwhelming.
We can make the difference.
DW Stories.
The world unpacked.
Pops up
on your For You page.
The info, the inspo.
And all the input you need.
DW Stories. Now on TikTok.
Every woman, every man knows that a child needs food. Without food, can do nothing.
Before Mary's Meals came, we had a lot of problems.
They drop out of the school because they were eating nothing when coming from home.
That could have easily been us. Any one of us.
This is DW News live from Berlin. With an eye on Russia, Joe Biden makes a show of solidarity with Nordic nations. The U.S. president hails NATO unity and praises Finland's accession to the alliance at talks with Nordic leaders in Helsinki. We'll bring you their joint press conference later this hour live. Also coming up, the United Nations says a mass grave has been found in Sudan.
Local people were forced to dispose of the bodies in a mass grave, denying those killed a decent burial.
The UN says at least 87 people were killed in a massacre in West Darfur and blames a paramilitary group. And southern Europe swelters. A heat wave is pushing temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius. Tourists are urged to take care in hot spots from Rome to Athens. We'll look at extreme weather around the world. And Germany's foreign minister unveils a new strategy for dealing with China. Amid rising political tensions, Annalena Baerbock says Germany wants to reduce its dependence on its biggest trading partner, but not at all costs. I'm Nicole Frillich. It's good to have you with us. U.S. President Joe Biden has met with the leaders of Nordic countries in the Finnish capital, Helsinki. Biden and the leaders of Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and Norway discussed their cooperation on security, environment, and technology. Biden welcomed Finland to NATO as its newest member, calling the country an incredible asset to the military alliance. Finland shares a long border with Russia, over 1,300 kilometers long. Biden's visit marks the end of his 5-day tour of Europe for the annual NATO summit. And for a closer look, we can now bring in Ronan Brown. He's a journalist with the Finnish broadcasting company Yle in Helsinki. Good to have you with us. Now, how important is Biden's visit to Helsinki for the Nordic countries?
Well, it's hugely significant for Finland. As you mentioned there, Biden said that Finland's accession to NATO was a very significant step. And certainly here in Finland, it's been seen as a kind of very historic visit here that Biden is making.
How big a topic was Sweden's accession, which now pretty much seems like a done deal?
In Finland, it's been a massive topic. When Finland joined NATO, the very first thing it did was to ratify Sweden's bid, and it's been seen that the two kind of went on this road together and should finish on this road together, Finland and Sweden. So it's been a huge deal, and it's been very welcome here in Finland that it looks like Sweden's membership bid is in the final stages.
Finland, as you mentioned, became a member back in April, and Biden praised Finland's entry extensively today. How has this recent shift from neutrality to NATO membership been received in Finland?
Well, previously there was sort of Finland had this what was termed this Finlandization policy, where they didn't really particularly want to sort of anger the eastern neighbour. And that kind of changed, obviously, on the 24th of February last year when Russia invaded Ukraine, because I think there was a realization that Russia could do this to its near neighbors. And of course, as you mentioned, Finland shares this very long border with Russia. So there was really a sea change, like in Finnish public and political opinion regarding joining NATO.
Is there a greater sense of security now to you as someone who has an ear to the ground there in Finland?
I think that there is. A lot of recent opinion polls have said that people do feel more secure now that Finland has this Article 5 guarantee and the backing of the other NATO nations. There does seem to be on the streets of Finland this greater sense of safety and security under NATO.
But military issues were not the only items on the agenda. Biden also called for closer cooperation on climate change, for example. What can the rest of the world, and the U.S. in particular, maybe learn about climate protection from the pioneering Nordic countries?
Well, I think certainly Finland has set this goal of being carbon neutral free by 2035, and that's seen as sort of a global leader in that respect. I think that would be certainly setting those goals and setting those targets is something that the United States could learn from. And also just I think there needs to be a cultural shift. I think in the Nordic countries, the environment has always been seen as very important. And within the Nordic countries, people have a very kind of unique relationship with their nature that I've seen elsewhere in the world. So I think that's also something that could be borrowed from the Nordic nations.
There's Ronan Brown, journalist with the Finnish broadcasting company Yle in Helsinki, Finland. Thank you so much for your analysis and your insights. And we'll be crossing live to Helsinki for Joe Biden's press conference with the Finnish president later in this hour. But first, let's turn to other news. And the United Nations Human Rights Office says it has found evidence of a mass grave in Sudan's West Darfur region. At least 87 people were buried there last month. The UN office says it has credible information that the breakaway Rapid Support Forces paramilitary and their allies carried out the massacre. It says many of the buried people belong to the non-Arab ethnic Masalit group. Their bodies were dumped in two shallow graves near the city of El Geneina. Ethnic violence has escalated in recent weeks, with rival military factions at war for months now. Ravina Shamdasani is a spokesperson from the United Nations Human Rights Office, and she gave more details.
Local people were forced to dispose of the bodies in a mass grave, denying those killed a decent burial in one of the city's cemeteries. At least 37 bodies were buried on the 20th of June in a 1-meter-deep mass grave. Another 50 bodies were buried on the same site the next day, including bodies of 7 women and 7 children.
Carl Schembri is in charge of Sudan operations at the Norwegian Refugee Council, and here's what he had to say about the latest developments.
Well, there is very little yet that we know beyond what has been announced today by the United Nations. What we do know is that Darfur is the seat, is the theater of widespread atrocities. We see that through our own staff, many of whom had to flee. Many fled through to South Sudan or other areas in the country itself, but they've fled from massacres, from all sorts of attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. All our offices and warehouses have been looted. So it's total mayhem. It's catastrophic for the civilians there. And today is the ultimate proof, if you like, that these atrocities are really being committed, and we need to get to the bottom of who did this, and these people need to be held accountable.
A severe heat wave is hitting hard across southern Europe. Temperatures are expected to surpass 40 degrees Celsius in parts of Italy, Spain, France, Greece, Croatia, and Turkey. In Rome, temperatures could reach as high as 43 degrees and a possible 47 degrees on the island of Sardinia. In the Greek capital Athens, maximum temperatures could reach 45 degrees on Saturday. Sweltering heat has made life harder for people. Authorities are urging residents and tourists to be cautious. Extreme temperatures are likely to continue into the weekend. Now, scientists say droughts, heat, wildfires, and other dangerous weather events are becoming more and more likely and severe due to climate change in most places worldwide. However, man-made global warming is not responsible for all weather disasters.
Floods in India, Spain, and parts of the US. Wildfires have been raging in Canada since April. More than 9 million hectares of forest have burned, and more than 150,000 people have had to flee their homes. At the same time, heat waves have been scorching Europe, particularly Spain.
I have one of these umbrellas here. And if shop owners allow, you can stand in front of the entrance. There's some cold air coming out. We just drink a lot of water. We have no other choice.
It's really sad. This is climate change, and we just have to get used to it somehow.
It's a crisis that has long since become a reality across the globe. Man-made climate change is making extreme weather more likely. Yet not all extreme weather can be attributed to a heating planet. For example, according to climate models, the heavy rain in northern Italy earlier this year weren't more intense or likely due to human-induced warming. It was actually an extremely rare and fierce weather event for the region. On the other hand, extreme heat waves in northern Africa and southern Europe last April, with temperatures up to 20 degrees above normal, were different. They would have been almost impossible at this time of year without climate change. And when it comes to the severe flooding that hit Pakistan in 2022, models suggest that global warming increased rainfall intensity there by 50%. The event affected 33 million people and destroyed 1.7 million homes.
A short while ago, DW spoke to Shaukia Philip, a climate scientist at the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute, and we asked her what indicators are used to prove climate change is at fault for a particular extreme weather event.
So we always start with observations. So we look at whether we can see a trend in observations. However, if we do see a trend, we still don't know whether it's climate change or maybe something else. So then we start looking at models as well. We need to use these models because we know exactly what we put in there. So we run a model twice. So once we run it with the climate conditions that are the current climate conditions, and once with the current conditions of the past. And if we know the difference between these two, then we know this is due to climate change. And if we then see the same trend in the models as we see in the observations, then we know that this is related to climate change.
Let's take a look now at some other stories making news around the world today. Climate activists have caused numerous flights to be cancelled at airports in Germany. Members of the group Last Generation entered the premises of Hamburg and Düsseldorf Airport and glued themselves to the runway during the peak holiday travel period. The protesters were demanding tougher government action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Thailand's front runner to become prime minister has failed to secure parliamentary support. Pita Limjaroenrat was the only candidate, but he was blocked by military-backed members of the Senate. A second vote is expected next week. Pita had pledged to reform strict laws protecting the monarchy and to reduce the military's influence. The Hollywood Actors Union, representing more than 170,000 workers, is likely to announce a strike after talks with film studios over a new contract collapsed. The entertainment industry workers have been demanding a raise in their payments and better working conditions. Germany's cabinet has approved its first ever strategy for dealing with China, its biggest trading partner, but also a potential geopolitical rival. The new policy says German companies must, quote, de-risk or reduce their dependence on Beijing without cutting off cooperation. Recent supply chain problems and human rights issues have caused concern here in Berlin. Now, Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock introduced the strategy.
We need to focus on our economic security more. So that means that cluster risks that don't just impact the individuals, but rather impact the entire national economy must be minimized. Thus, companies that make themselves particularly dependent on the Chinese market will increasingly have to bear the financial burden of this risk. And part of the economic security is that companies need to ensure that in their supply chains they are aware of the human rights and ensure that they are not violated. Naturally, we have a responsibility to human rights, but we also have to reduce the risk for Germany as a business location and also Europe, because if we accept the violations of human rights, this will also have impact on European countries.
Let's dig into this and bring in DW Chief International Editor Richard Walker. Welcome. Richard, after months of negotiations, the German government has now finally presented a China strategy for the very first time. What took so long?
Yeah, it really did take a while, didn't it? I mean, they talked about this in the coalition agreement, which they signed, I think Annalena Baerbock said in her speech there today, 83 weeks ago. They said that they wanted to come up with this strategy. Here it is, finally. I think the fact that it took so long points to a few things. First of all, that the content is pretty controversial, that you have quite differing views within the government. You have the foreign ministry, which is led by Annalena Baerbock, which is known as being pretty critical of China, pretty hawkish, pretty keen to have a profound rethink of relations. At the other end of the scale, then you have the Chancellery, so the boss's office, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, very cautious about relations with China, not wanting to rock the boat too much, thinking amid all of the economic turbulence that the world is seeing right now, that Germany can't afford to really hack away at its relationship with China, which has been so lucrative over the years. Add to that the fact that they've also in parallel been working on a national security strategy, which took a long time, covering the broader question of national security. And it adds up to a slow process. But I think one thing I would definitely add here at this point, Nicole, is interesting that they published this strategy in the middle of the summer holidays, so the Parliament is on recess, so parliamentarians are not here to debate it in Parliament. The fact that Annalena Baerbock announced this on her own, she did not have Olaf Scholz at her side, she did not have other ministers at her side. Unlike recently when the national security strategy was announced, when you had Scholz, when you had Baerbock, you also had the defense minister, the finance minister, the interior minister, all there, all announcing this one thing. So it feels very low-key, almost like this government is not holding this strategy up as a really flagship policy, something that the Chancellor's office in particular doesn't seem to really want to have its hands all over.
Mm-hmm. There is a new buzzword, though, looking at this, de-risking. It's not decoupling anymore, it's de-risking. And the Chancellor has also used it repeatedly. What exactly does de-risking mean from the German perspective?
Yeah, so de-risking is a term that almost every Western country, and Japan is also talking about it now as well. The G7 recently had it in their communique. It's a term that all of these countries are managing to kind of gather around. One reason is that it's pretty vague. I mean, it sounds good, right? You want to reduce the risk in the relationship with China. So that sounds like something which is absolutely sensible. The question is, what's a risk and what's not a risk? And there are some questions where that is seen as relatively clear. For instance, the fact that many German companies and companies elsewhere too reliant on China for up to 90% of some of the key kind of raw materials that you need for high-tech products, these so-called rare earths. So this idea that you cannot be so dependent on one supplier, that being a very obvious lesson from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that Germany was way too dependent on its natural gas and had to really deal with some major fallout there. So that's one risk that everyone agrees on. Too much dependency on raw materials, try to diversify there. But there are other risks where it's debated. For instance, is it okay that the Chinese state shipping company COSCO bought a stake in Germany's most important harbour recently in Hamburg? The Chancellor thinks that's fine. The Foreign Minister did not think that was fine. Is it okay for Huawei to have such a big presence in Germany's 5G network? That is debated. Is it okay for German car companies to get such a big chunk of their profits from China? Many think that's not okay. Olaf Scholz seems to think that it's okay to leave that to the markets. It's up to the companies themselves to work through that risk. So that within this term de-risking, there's a huge range of interpretations. And there's not total clarity coming out of this strategy. This strategy really just gives kind of pointers rather than necessarily giving real yardsticks to measure these things.
Mm-hmm. You've watched the German-Chinese relationship very closely. How does this attempt at de-risking match the fact that just recently China signed a number of heavyweight contracts with Germany's business leaders?
Yeah, so this happened just recently. The Chinese government was here for consultations with the German government, the first time that they'd done that in person for several years because of the pandemic coming in between. And you had Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, and his Chinese counterpart at a signing ceremony in the business ministry here in Berlin, clapping away as Mercedes, as Volkswagen, as BMW, and other major German companies, their CEOs sat down and signed deals with the Chinese side. This was seen as a real sign of kind of business as usual, and also Scholz standing there and clapping away while these deals were being signed, kind of giving an implication of state support for these relationships, the state blessing on this kind of major deal between the two sides. At the same time, in this China strategy, which we've just had launched by Annalena Baerbock, she has been stressing that Germany is trying to kind of put the brakes on its implicit support for doing business on that scale with China. For instance, they're capping what you call the investment guarantee. So if a big German company wants to build a factory in another country, Germany is now capping the guarantee that until now, the insurance policy, if you like, that they've offered for deals like that to 3 billion euros per company, per country. So saying that it's trying to tweak the incentives, which until now from Germany have really kind of been all in on China, trying to tweak those incentives to have more of a kind of a handle with care banner over them. But still, it's going to be potentially a mismatch between what we see from Olaf Scholz as very cautious on this, trying to keep the business relationship going, trying to, does that come out on top of the Baerbock approach of trying to reduce this risk? We don't know yet. We're going to have to see over the coming months and coming years how much of an impact this strategy really has. But a lot of people are saying the fact that it's there and the fact that it's right in black and white as a message to business and to politics is meaningful in itself.
Germany's never-ending tightrope act. That was DW's Richard Walker on Germany's new China strategy. Thank you so much. You're watching DW News. Still to come this hour. We'll be crossing live to Helsinki for Joe Biden's press conference following talks with Nordic leaders. You can see live pictures there, but it hasn't started just yet, so stay tuned. After 6 decades of armed conflict, large areas of Colombia are still controlled by armed groups, despite a peace deal agreed to by the government and the biggest rebel faction, FARC. Authorities estimate that tens of thousands of children were forced to fight for these groups during the decade before the peace agreement. Many continue to do so. TW's Felipe Abondano met 2 young men who managed to escape from their captors. We've changed their names to protect their identities, but be advised, some viewers may find parts of the next report disturbing.
Ramon, not his real name, is now training to be an architect. At 14, he was forced to take victims of an illegal clan to secret locations, where they were tortured and dismembered.
You'd see machetes and axes covered in blood. Those who did it would come out with their overalls also covered in blood. You'd hear the screams.
The clan forced Ramon to be present. It was a test of character.
You'd have to watch, just as if you were watching TV, until it gets to the point where they say, "You are ready now," and they tell you to go and kill someone.
Another boy we'll call Julio was forcibly recruited when he was just 10. He's now studying to become a civil engineer.